They say justice is blind. And maybe that's true. Maybe the ideal of it, the marble and scales version above courthouse doors, genuinely doesn't see the clothes you wear or the car you drive or the particular shade of your skin on a Tuesday evening when all you want is a decent meal. But the people who administer it, the ones with the lanyards and clipboards and authority they've worn so long it's fused to their personality like a second skin, they see everything. The table you choose, the way you sit, the notebook you open, the wine you ordered, the fact that you are alone. They build a story out of those details in the time it takes most people to read a menu, and then they act on that story with the confidence of someone who has never once been wrong. Derek Paulson made that decision in approximately 45 seconds. He looked at table 7 and he decided. And that decision, casual, automatic, practiced, cost him everything he had spent 22 years constructing. But here's what people miss when they hear stories like this. Men like Derek Paulson don't stumble into catastrophic error by accident. They practice it, they refine it, they perform it, Tuesday after Tuesday, in front of staff who've learned that looking away is part of the job, and customers who've learned that silence is the price of a quiet evening. He had done this before. The system had protected him before. He had no reason to believe this particular Tuesday would be different. What he didn't see, because it didn't fit the narrative he'd assembled in 45 seconds, was who was actually sitting at table 7. Not who she appeared to be, not even close. Stay for every word of this one, because what happened next didn't just change one man's career, it changed the law. Claudette Renee Okafor had driven herself to Thornwood Grill that Tuesday evening in a 7-year-old Honda Accord that needed new brake pads. She'd noticed the sound they made pulling into the parking lot, a faint metallic whisper against the rotor on the driver's side, and made a quiet mental note to schedule the appointment that weekend. She did things like that, noticed the details, filed them, addressed them systematically and without drama, at the appropriate time, through the appropriate channels. It was a habit she had developed over 30 years of professional life, born from the specific discipline required to hold contradictory arguments in working memory simultaneously and assess them without flinching. You develop that kind of mental organization, or you drown in the volume of what the job demands. She had developed it. The parking lot outside Thornwood Grill was half full. It was that particular hour of an autumn evening when the light turns the color of old copper and everything looks slightly more cinematic than it actually is. The Harrow district had undergone a renovation over the past decade, the kind of gentrification that replaces hardware stores with wine bars and replaces working-class regulars with people who describe themselves as foodies on social media. And Thornwood Grill sat at the heart of it. The building had once manufactured industrial textile components. The original factory windows were still there, tall and arched, with the thick glass that doesn't exist in modern construction. And in the amber of the evening light, they threw long rectangular shadows across the hardwood floors inside. The air near the entrance smelled of burnt butter and fresh rosemary. Someone in the kitchen was doing something with garlic that announced itself 20 feet before the door. Claudette Okafor was 53 years old. Her hair was natural, close-cropped, shot through at the temples with silver she had stopped fighting approximately 4 years ago, one morning when she looked in the mirror and decided there were better things to spend energy on. She wore charcoal slacks, pressed with the precise crease of someone who takes that particular detail seriously, and a burgundy silk blouse she had bought during a judicial conference in Brussels 3 years prior. Her reading glasses hung from a thin silver chain around her neck. She carried a slim leather portfolio, dark brown, the kind with a full legal pad inside, and in her bag was a collection of analytical philosophy essays she'd been working through for the past month. Not recreational reading, working reading, The kind of reading that requires a pen and an argument. She had a reservation. 7:15 under Okafor, party of one, made 2 days prior through the restaurant's mobile app. The confirmation email had arrived within seconds, cheerful and automated, with a digital floor map, the evening's specials listed in a tasteful font, and a note that the seasonal short rib had been receiving particularly enthusiastic feedback. A colleague on the court, Judge Marianne Tesh, who had been eating at Thornwood Grill since it opened and considered herself a minor authority on its menu, had recommended it specifically for Tuesday evenings, when the kitchen ran at full capacity, but the dining room never quite reached uncomfortable density. "It's the one night," Marianne had said, "when you can actually hear yourself think." The hostess who greeted her was a young woman with an intricate braided updo and the particular warmth of someone who genuinely enjoys the first 30 seconds of every customer interaction. She'd led Claudette to table 7, near the back wall, partially sheltered by a decorative wooden partition, with a clear sight line to the room, but slightly removed from its center of gravity. A good table for someone who wants to observe without being the focal point. She handed over the menu, took the drink order, Malbec, whatever they had open, and moved away with a smile that was actual rather than performed. The wine arrived in 4 minutes. Claudette opened her notebook. She wrote 3 lines about a pending opinion she was drafting, a Fourth Amendment case involving the scope of warrantless digital searches conducted incident to arrest, a question on which circuit courts had split in ways that were starting to create real practical problems for law enforcement and defendants alike. She studied what she'd written, crossed out the second line, rewrote it, then set the pen down and looked at the menu. The short rib, obviously. She wasn't there to make a point. She wasn't performing anything. She was a woman at the end of a 14-hour workday who wanted good food, relative quiet, and an hour in which no one needed a decision from her. Her usual Tuesday restaurant, a small Italian place on Delmore Street that the owner kept running through what appeared to be pure, stubborn affection for the city, was closed that week for a private event. Thornwood Grill was the reasonable alternative. She ordered, she sipped her wine, she made notes in the margins of her legal pad, and she let the evening settle around her like something earned. She did not look up when other tables filled. She did not inventory the room, or register where the exits were, or assess who else was dining alone. She was not on duty. She was eating dinner. The irony of what happened next was not lost on her when it began. It rarely was. Derek Paulson had managed Thornwood Grill for 11 of its 12 years in operation. Marcus Veit, who owned the building and the concept and the wine program he liked to discuss at length with people who hadn't asked, had hired Derek in year 2, when the restaurant was still in the fragile phase where every good review felt like a reprieve and every bad one felt like the beginning of the end. Derek had stabilized things. He was, by the metrics Marcus chose to track, revenue, table turns, Yelp rating, repeat bookings, a competent manager. The kind of competent that doesn't require you to look too closely at the methods. The Yelp rating held at 4.2. The health inspections went smoothly. The staff turnover was high, but Derek attributed that to the general instability of the restaurant industry, and Marcus found that explanation convenient enough not to examine further. What Marcus didn't track, or chose not to track, was the texture of the place under Derek's management. The way certain tables were steered towards certain guests, the way some reservations were lost in the system with a specific consistency, the way Derek's antenna for what he called problem energy, a phrase he used freely with his assistant manager, a patient and increasingly exhausted woman named Priya Anand, activated with a reliability that correlated in ways Priya had started noticing and cataloging privately, because she was someone who paid attention and someone who understood that the thing she was noticing had a name. Derek was 41 years old, pale, with the reddish undertone that comes from daily stress and regular drinking. Not large, medium height, but with the practiced inflation of a man who has learned to take up space through posture and projection. His most distinctive feature was his nose, which announced itself in profile, broad across the bridge, slightly bulbous at the tip, threaded with the fine red capillaries of elevated blood pressure sustained over years. His black shirt was consistently a half size too small across the shoulders, producing the perpetual impression of someone bracing. He breathed through his nose with a faint, audible whistle, low, intermittent, that Priya had mentioned to 3 colleagues in the conspiratorial register of a person who needs to have said it to someone. His tell was the neck. When Derek Paulson was agitated, his right hand went to the back of his neck, fingers working at the short hair there. His entire staff read it as an instruction to become very busy with something on the other side of the room. He first noticed Claudette Okafor at approximately 7:40. She'd been seated for 25 minutes, had ordered the short rib, and was sitting with her notebook open, occasionally writing, occasionally pausing to look at nothing in the middle distance, the way thinkers do when they're working something through. She was not loud. She was not demanding. By every measure Derek used to assess problem diners, she registered as a 0. And yet, he watched her from the service corridor for 4 minutes. His hand went to his neck. He watched the way she sat, straight-backed, self-contained, unhurried, and something about that specific combination bothered him in a way he would spend many subsequent months failing to explain adequately. He approached from the side, not the front, where a person would naturally see you coming, where the social contract of approach and acknowledgement operates normally. From the side, at an angle, the way you come at something you haven't finished categorizing. "Excuse me." His voice had the quality of authority that exists without foundation, projected, covering the distance to the nearby tables, but thin at its center, the way wood sounds when the core has gone soft. "Can I ask what you're doing here?" She looked up. Her reading glasses were on now, low on her nose, and she looked over the top of them at him with an expression so precisely calibrated between patience and assessment that it functioned as a complete sentence. It should have stopped him cold. It didn't. "I'm having dinner," she said. The voice was measured, not loud, not deferential either, the kind of measured that comes from decades of choosing each word with the deliberateness of someone who understands that words, once said, become part of the record. "Are you waiting for someone?" "I have a reservation, party of 1. A fractional lift of the wine glass, not quite a toast, more like an acknowledgement. "I intend to remain a party of 1. I've already ordered." His fingers went to his neck. "I've had a report," he said. Even as it left his mouth, you could hear the engineering fail, too formal, too abrupt, with none of the texture that true reports accumulate. It was a scaffold without the building. A customer concern, about someone matching your description making other guests uncomfortable. Claudette Okafor set the wine glass down. She closed the notebook with a precise motion. She removed her reading glasses and let them fall to the chain at her chest. And then she looked at him with the particular directness of someone who has spent decades in rooms where directness is the only currency that matters. "What description?" she said. He didn't answer that. The silence where the answer should have been was, itself, an answer. He knew it. She knew it. The server, Jonah, 23 years old and recently graduated, and 3 months into this job that he'd taken while he figured out what came next, was standing at the service station near the wall with a water pitcher he did not need, listening. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to see some ID to verify your reservation." "You haven't asked anyone else at any other table for ID to verify their reservation. It's standard procedure when there's a concern." "You've said concern twice now and specified nothing. What is the concern? What is the description?" Her voice had not changed in temperature or volume. She was not performing anger. She was asking a question with the clarity of someone who asks questions for a living and requires complete answers. "My name is Okafor. My reservation is in the system. You can verify it in 10 seconds. Ma'am. Using ma'am as a rhythmic pause doesn't make this more professional. It makes it less. She paused. 1 beat. Check the system. His jaw moved. His breathing became slightly more audible. He shifted his weight toward her. Not dramatically, not the lunge of a man losing his temper, but the deliberate encroachment of a man accustomed to using physical proximity as a tool of pressure. He leaned fractionally over the table. I'm going to need you to either provide ID or vacate the premises. On what legal grounds? Trespassing. She looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the restaurant had shifted, not dramatically, not with any single person making a visible display of attention, but with the collective, subtle reorientation of a room that has registered that something is happening at table 7. The couple at table 9 had stopped their conversation. A woman at the bar, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, had turned slightly on her stool. Jonah had not moved from the service station. He had, however, shifted the water pitcher to his left hand and slid his right hand toward his phone. You are asking me to leave a restaurant where I hold a confirmed reservation, where food has been ordered and a drink has been served, where I have been seated by your staff without incident, based on an unspecified description and a concern you have declined to name. She spoke evenly, with the precision of someone building a record, because she was building a record. I want you to hear yourself say that clearly. I've been clear. You've been consistent, she replied. That's different. He made the phone call at 7:52. He walked to the host station to make it, which meant that the hostess with the braided updo heard every word, and the FedEx driver who'd been waiting at the side entrance with a supply delivery heard it through the door he was holding open with his foot, and Jonah heard it from the service station, and the woman at the bar, whose name was Cassandra Wells, who was a staff writer for the Harrow Examiner, and who had come in for a drink after an interview that had run long, heard it clearly, and opened the voice recorder on her phone. The specific phrase Derek used was, "I've got a black woman refusing to leave, possibly loitering. She's being aggressive." He said it in his normal speaking voice, not quietly, not with any apparent awareness that he was being recorded or witnessed. He said it as someone says a thing they have said before, in roughly similar terms, to a dispatcher who has heard it before, in a city that had processed those calls before, without significant disruption. Cassandra Wells did not close her recorder. Officer Dale Rennick arrived at 8:04. He was 37, with the composed, slightly tired professionalism of someone who handles exactly this kind of call twice a week in this neighborhood, and has learned to project calm as a first tool and a last resort. He came through the door, scanned the room with the automatic efficiency of training, spotted Derek by the host station, and the two men had a conversation that lasted 83 seconds. Then both of them walked toward table 7. Claudette had not moved. Her short rib had arrived. The kitchen had continued operating, because the kitchen operates regardless, and she had eaten approximately a third of it. She had refilled her water glass from the carafe on the table. She was writing in her notebook again, and she completed the sentence she was in the middle of before she looked up. "Ma'am," Rennick said, "I've received a report that you've been asked to leave and have refused. Can you tell me what's going on?" "I have a confirmed reservation. I ordered food. I'm eating it. I was asked to leave without lawful grounds. I declined, which is my right." She set the pen down carefully. "Are you detaining me?" Rennick shifted his weight. "I'm asking you to step outside so we can... If I'm being detained, tell me I'm being detained and state the grounds. If I'm not being detained, this conversation is concluded, and I'd like to finish my dinner." "She's resisting," Derek said from behind Rennick's left shoulder, in the tone of someone providing a running commentary that nobody requested. "I'd appreciate if you didn't characterize my behavior," Claudette said to Derek, without turning to look at him. Her eyes stayed on Rennick. "Officer, I want to be precise with you. This man called you based on nothing except that I am a black woman sitting alone in this restaurant. He stated I was aggressive. I have not raised my voice. I have not made any physical movement toward anyone. I have not violated any law or ordinance. I have a reservation, a confirmation email, a paid drink, and a dinner I ordered and am currently eating. I am documenting this interaction. So is the woman at the bar." She glanced toward Cassandra briefly. "You are about to make a decision. I am asking you to make it with complete information." Rennick looked at Derek. Derek's fingers were at his neck, working. "I want her out," Derek said. And that's where it happened. The moment. The one that would be discussed in law schools, in newsrooms, in the state legislature, in a federal courtroom, and in the quiet private arguments that police officers have with themselves in the hours after shifts that didn't go the way they'd been trained to hope. Officer Dale Rennick reached for his handcuffs. She was on her feet before the metal cleared the holster. Not scrambling, not flinching, standing, because she was not going to receive this at a table, seated, looking up. She rose to her full height, which was not inconsiderable, and she looked at Rennick with an expression that contained no panic whatsoever. "You are completing a decision right now," she said, and her voice was quieter than it had been all evening. Quieter is sometimes louder when the room has gone still enough to carry it. "I am asking you, as clearly as I know how, one final time. Verify who I am before you complete this action." "Lady, I don't need to verify anything," Rennick said. The uncertainty was there now, a small, insistent voice trying to get his attention. But the machinery was in motion, and Derek was behind him saying, "Do your job," and the room was watching. And sometimes, the hardest thing in the world is to stop something you've already started. "Save it for the judge," Derek said. The irony of this phrase, the specific, extraordinary irony of it, would later be reproduced in the AP report, in the Times piece, in the legal commentary, in Cassandra Wells's article, without any additional editorializing, because it required none. The handcuffs went on at 8:11. Claudette Okafor stood with her hands behind her back and her posture unchanged, and said nothing further. She had said everything necessary. The rest was evidence. Sergeant Angela Morrow arrived at 8:23. She was responding to Rennick's call for backup. The detainee was not cooperating with processing, which in this case meant she had continued to be calm and precise and entirely unwilling to pretend the situation was other than what it was. Morrow was 15 years on the force, which had given her a specific, practical intelligence about situations. The ability to recognize, within the first few seconds of information, the difference between a situation she could manage and a situation that was already managing her. She ran the name in the car on the way over. Standard procedure. Claudette Renee Okafor. Party of 1, Table 7. She sat in the parking lot for 45 seconds after the screen returned its results. Then she called her lieutenant. The call lasted 2 minutes. Then she went inside. Sergeant Morrow moved through the door of Thornwood Grill at a pace that her colleagues would have recognized immediately. Not running, not rushing, but with the specific directional purpose of someone who has understood the full shape of what they're walking into. She took in Rennick. She took in Derek Paulson. She took in the woman standing in handcuffs near table 7 with the posture of someone who is deeply, genuinely unbothered. Not because she isn't aware of the gravity of the situation, but because gravity requires fear, and fear requires uncertainty, and she was not uncertain about anything. Morrow looked at the leather portfolio on the table, the legal pad, the half-finished short rib, the Malbec at 2/3. "Dale," she said. "Sarge, take the cuffs off, right now." The color left Rennick's face in a visible wave, traveling from his hairline downward. He looked at Morrow, and she looked back at him with the expression of someone who will explain everything in a moment and knows he is going to need to find a wall to lean against. He removed the handcuffs. His hands were not entirely steady. Sergeant Morrow turned to Claudette Okafor. "Justice Okafor," she said, and the word justice landed in the room like something dropped from a height. "I am deeply sorry for what has occurred here tonight. Sergeant." Quiet, precise. "How many minutes was I in handcuffs?" Morrow checked. "Approximately 12 minutes. 12 minutes." She rubbed her wrists. Once, briefly, the practical motion of someone taking inventory rather than performing discomfort, and then her hands were still again. "I need to make a phone call." Derek Paulson had heard the title. He had heard the change in Morrow's voice. His mental arithmetic was visible on his face. You could watch the calculation happening, the search for the variable that would make this resolve differently, the desperate inventory of explanations that might still distribute the weight of this evening away from him. "She didn't, if she'd identified herself, I would have. How was I supposed to know that she asked you to verify who she was," Morrow said flatly. "Multiple times. You have staff who heard it. There's a recording." She nodded fractionally toward the bar. "At least one." "She didn't look like a judge," Derek Paulson said. 11 words, out loud. In a room that contained, among other witnesses, a FedEx driver who had set his packages on the floor and was holding his phone at waist height, recording. Jonah, the server, whose phone had been recording video for the past 11 minutes from the service station. Cassandra Wells, staff writer, with her voice recorder app running and her press credentials in her bag. The hostess with the braided updo. The couple from Table 9 who had stopped eating entirely. Every staff member visible in the dining room. And approximately 14 other diners who had been progressively paying attention since the handcuffs appeared. 11 words, recorded from 5 separate devices. They would run in every article, every broadcast package, every legal filing, every legislative testimony that came after. They would appear, without commentary, as the title of Cassandra Wells's piece, which ran at 6:45 the following morning and was shared 47,000 times in its first 14 hours. Claudette Okafor made one phone call. 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The person she called was the Honorable Victor Chu, colleague, friend, and, in his previous career, one of the most accomplished federal civil rights litigators in the region. He arrived at 9:15. With him was Simone Beaumont, 47 years old, natural locks, charcoal blazer, senior counsel at the Federal Advocacy Project. She had a briefcase. She opened it on table 7 and worked with the focused intensity of someone who has prepared 20 years for a case this clean. She spoke with Derek Paulson for 6 minutes. She informed him that the U.S. Attorney's Office had been contacted, that 3 video recordings had been secured, that Sergeant Morrow had given a preliminary statement, that Jonah and the hostess and the FedEx driver had all provided statements, and that Cassandra Wells, press credentials verified, had a voice recording capturing the entirety of the interaction, including the specific statement made to Sergeant Morrow following Justice Okafor's release. She did not repeat the statement. She didn't need to. Derek Paulson knew exactly which 11 words she meant. His attorney was reached at 9:58. The attorney advised Derek to stop talking. He had been talking for 47 minutes by that point. Cassandra Wells's piece ran online the following morning at 6:45. The headline was a direct quote. By 8, it had been picked up by both major state papers. By noon, it had gone national. 47,000 shares by 3 in the afternoon. By the following morning, the story was in the Times, the Post, and AP dispatches running in 400 outlets. The video, Jonah's, the most clearly framed of the 3, had been viewed 11 million times in 72 hours. 11 words, clearly audible, unambiguous, attributed without dispute. Simone Beaumont's investigation ran for 4 weeks. Over 7 years, Thornwood Grill had accumulated 43 formal discrimination complaints. 31 had been submitted to the city's restaurant licensing board and dismissed, without investigation, without notation, without the procedural steps the board's own charter required. 12 had been submitted directly to the restaurant and never forwarded to any regulatory body. Of those 43 complaints, 37 involved customers who identified as Black or Latino. Dr. Raymond Park, a sociologist at the State University who specialized in discrimination pattern analysis, examined the distribution and found that the probability of it occurring by chance was less than 1 in 4,000. She found Marcus Veit's emails to his insurance provider, messages spanning 3 years, in which he described discrimination complaints as nuisance claims and outlined a strategy for ensuring they were dismissed before reaching formal proceedings. She found that Derek Paulson had called police on restaurant guests 7 times in 4 years. 6 of those guests were people of color. 5 calls resulted in no action. 1 resulted in a wrongful detention, settled quietly for $22,000, sealed, and, critically, never disclosed to the licensing board during renewal, despite a requirement mandating disclosure of all discrimination-related civil settlements within the preceding 5 years. That concealment was the hinge. Simone Beaumont brought it to the U.S. Attorney with the statistical pattern, the email documentation, and the sealed settlement. The U.S. Attorney, who had previously noted a discrepancy in Thornwood Grill's licensing file without the connective tissue to understand it, now had everything he needed. Marcus Veit was charged under 18 U.S.C. Section 241, Conspiracy Against Civil Rights, and under Section 1001, making false statements to a federal licensing authority. The state licensing certification for restaurants of Thornwood Grill's size and category contained federal compliance components, which brought the concealment of the civil settlement within federal jurisdiction. An obstruction charge was added 3 weeks into the investigation, when discovery produced emails suggesting that 3 complaints had been intercepted and destroyed prior to the board's renewal audit. The trial was held in the city's federal courthouse, a building of pale limestone and deliberate formality, 3 miles from the Harrow district, occupying a different emotional world entirely. It ran for 14 weeks. Justice Okafor did not preside, recused as material witness and complainant, but she sat in the gallery on the day the verdict came in her charcoal slacks and burgundy blouse, hands folded in her lap. The testimony that became the center of the case was not hers. It was a woman named Denise Fontaine, who took the stand on the 9th day of trial. Denise was 44 years old, a registered nurse at the city's main hospital, who had 3 years prior attempted to dine at Thornwood Grill with her 8-year-old daughter for the child's birthday. Derek Paulson had told them their reservation couldn't be located. Denise showed him the confirmation email on her phone. He told them the restaurant was at capacity, at which point Denise's daughter, in a dress she had chosen herself, hair in 2 braids with small white beads, pressed her face to the front window and said with the uncomplicated clarity of a child who hasn't learned to doubt her own eyes, "Mommy, there are empty tables." Denise Fontaine had looked at her daughter's face in that moment. She performed the calculation that Black women and men and children perform constantly, the specific arithmetic of how much insistence will cost, what shape it will take, what the child will absorb, what the night will become. She took her daughter's hand. They ate chicken nuggets at a chain restaurant 6 blocks away. The girl said it was still a good birthday, which was the kindest and most devastating thing she could possibly have said. Denise went home and filed a complaint with the licensing board. It was dismissed within 72 hours, without investigation, without contact, without notation in the restaurant's file. She testified to this for 41 minutes. The defense attorney offered no cross-examination. The courtroom was profoundly quiet. Judge Constance Merritt looked at the jury and later described it, in a post-retirement interview, as the moment she understood most completely what the case was actually about. Marcus Veit was convicted on all counts, 30 months federal minimum. He appealed. A 3-judge panel upheld the conviction unanimously. His attorney issued a statement calling the outcome a profound misapplication of federal civil rights law to ordinary business decisions. The U.S. Attorney's Office issued a statement with a single sentence in response. The jury disagreed. Derek Paulson, charged separately at the state level with filing a false police report and submitting a false discrimination complaint, the specific language he had used with dispatch was demonstrably inaccurate in 3 distinct factual respects, accepted a plea agreement. He surrendered his restaurant manager's certification, which was required by state licensing law for anyone managing a licensed food service establishment. He was fined $87,000, the combined settlement amount of 2 reopened civil cases, Denise Fontaine's and Justice Okafor's, both of which Simone Beaumont had pursued through the Federal Advocacy Project. Justice Okafor directed her entire settlement, $230,000, to a civil rights legal assistance fund that provides no-cost representation to people who have been discriminated against in public accommodations. She kept nothing. He was also required to complete 600 hours of community service. He completed them. He did not speak publicly about the case during that period, following his attorney's ongoing advice. Thornwood Grill closed 4 months after the verdict. The city's licensing board, facing evidence from the federal investigation, commissioned an internal audit. The audit found that 17 other licensed establishments had benefited from comparable dismissal patterns over 6 years. The board's director resigned. 2 licensing compliance officers were terminated. A redesigned complaint adjudication system was implemented. Mandatory response timelines, required documentation standards, independent review panels with community representation, and an automatic referral mechanism for any complaint describing conduct consistent with federal civil rights statutes. 6 months after the verdict, Justice Okafor testified before the state legislature's Judiciary Committee for 2 hours. She did not focus on herself. She focused on Denise Fontaine, on the weight of the choice Denise had made in front of her 8-year-old daughter, on the broader architecture of exhaustion that repeated low-stakes humiliations build over a lifetime, on the way silence enforced by the calculation of costs becomes the foundation on which systems like Thornwood Grills are constructed and maintained. Her testimony contributed directly to the passage of the Restaurant Accountability and Non-Discrimination Enforcement Act, statewide protocols for discrimination complaint processing, mandatory public reporting, a state-funded investigation unit, and enhanced penalties for concealment of discrimination settlements in licensing proceedings. The act was named, informally, the Maya Act. For Denise Fontaine's daughter, who had pressed her face to a window and pointed at empty tables, Officer Dale Rennick completed a mandatory review before the Oversight Board. The board found his conduct reflected inadequate independent assessment and inappropriate deference to a complainant with a documented history of racialized reporting. He was not terminated. He completed 40 hours of bias and de-escalation training, chosen by himself, not assigned. He was placed on 12-month probation. His public apology contained a line that was widely quoted. "I should have stopped when she asked me to. I knew something was wrong, and I kept going anyway." By most accounts of those present, he meant it. Derek Paulson works the night shift at a regional distribution warehouse 12 miles outside the city. He is 43 now. He gave one interview, 2 years after the trial, to a podcast examining the victims of accountability culture. He maintained he had been doing his job as he understood it, that he had no way of knowing who the woman at table 7 was. that if she had identified herself, none of this would have happened. He did not appear to understand that identifying herself was precisely what she had repeatedly asked him to allow her to do. He seemed quite comfortable with the version of events in which he was a reasonable man who had simply run out of luck. Some people stay comfortable in the wrong story their entire lives. Claudette Renee Okafor is still on the bench. Last year, she authored the majority opinion in Fontaine v. City Board, establishing a new evidentiary standard for when documented pattern evidence of racialized exclusion can pierce the business judgment rule in licensing decisions. It has been cited in 4 other states within 8 months. Legal scholars describe it as one of the most significant expansions of civil rights enforcement doctrine in public accommodations law in 2 decades. She still eats alone sometimes. She still prefers a corner table, a glass of red wine, something worth writing in the margins about. She still makes reservations through apps and still receives confirmation emails she doesn't preserve for any particular reason. Just the ordinary informational residue of an ordinary plan. She doesn't announce herself when she walks in. She doesn't perform anything. She sits down and opens her notebook and orders whatever the colleague recommended and lets the evening be what it is. The whole point, the entire aching point, is that she should be able to do that, exactly that, unremarked upon, unbothered, just a woman with a notebook and a glass of wine, which is what she was at 7:15 when she sat down at table 7, and which is what Derek Paulson decided, in 45 seconds and without asking a single accurate question, that she couldn't possibly be. The question the case asked, the question it is still asking, in the courts, in the licensing boards, in the legislative sessions, is not why he didn't recognize her. It's why recognition was required at all, why the accountability only appeared when the credential did, why Denise Fontaine, who had no title and no bench and no judicial colleague on speed dial, had to take her daughter to eat chicken nuggets on her birthday, while Derek Paulson's complaint was quietly filed and quietly dismissed and quietly forgotten. That's what Justice Okafor testified about. That's what Simone Beaumont is still litigating about. That's what the Maya Act is trying, imperfectly and with the ordinary friction of all legislation, to build into the structure of the thing. Justice isn't blind, but it's working, slowly, with effort, against the resistance of every system that has learned to profit from its selective vision, to see past the details it was trained to use as proxies. Trained by 1,000 Derek Paulsons who looked at a woman in a restaurant and built a complete fiction in 45 seconds, and then defended that fiction, loudly and publicly and on the record, all the way to the end. He said she didn't look like a judge. She looked exactly like one. He just didn't have the framework to recognize it. And he had spent so many years in a system that protected the gaps in his framework that he'd never had reason to build it. Until now, until table 7, until 11 words that landed in a room full of witnesses and recording devices and a reporter with a press badge and a conscience and a deadline. Here's what I want to know from you, and I mean this genuinely, not as a formality. What would you have done in her position? Would you have identified yourself the moment Derek approached? Handed over the credential before the handcuffs entered the conversation? Or would you have done what she did? Waited, documented, let the full weight of the decision settle on the person making it? There's no wrong answer, and I suspect a lot of you have navigated versions of this exact calculation in restaurants and parking lots and stores and airports, and I want to hear about it in the comments. If this story hit the way it hit me, tap that like button. It genuinely helps this community grow. Subscribe and ring that notification bell so you're here when the next one drops. Because justice, when it finally moves, is always worth watching from the front row.